Surprised by Joy, Professor C.S. Lewis, 1955, Magdalen College, Oxford University, London. Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life by Professor C.S. Lewis, Episode 1. Surprised by joy, impatient as the wind. Wordsworth. Dedicated to Dombede Griffiths, OSB. Preface. This book is written partly in answer to requests that I would tell how I passed from atheism to Christianity, and partly to correct one or two false notions that seem to have got about. How far the story matters to anyone but myself depends on the degree to which others have experienced what I call joy. If it is at all common, a more detailed treatment of it than has, I believe, been attempted before may be of some use. I have been emboldened to write of it because I notice that a man seldom mentions what he had supposed to be his most idiosyncratic sensations without receiving from at least one, often more, of those present the reply, "What? Have you felt that too? I always thought I was the only one." The book aims at telling the story of my conversion and is not a general autobiography, still less confessions like those of Saint Augustine or Rousseau. This means in practice that it gets less like a general autobiography as it goes on. In the early chapters, the net has to be spread pretty wide in order that when the explicitly spiritual crisis arise, the reader may understand what sort of person my childhood and adolescence had made me. When the build-up is complete, I confine myself strictly to business and omit everything, however important by ordinary biographical standards, which seems at that stage irrelevant. I do not think there is much loss. I never read an autobiography in which the parts devoted to the earlier years were not far the most interesting. The story is, I fear, suffocatingly subjective, the kind of thing I have never written before and shall probably never write again. I have tried so to write the first chapter that those who can't bear such a story will see at once what they are in for and close the book with the least waste of time. CSL, Professor C.S. Lewis. Surprised by joy, the shape of my early life. Chapter 1. The first years. Happy, but for so happy ill-secured. Milton. I was born in the winter of 1898 at Belfast, the son of a solicitor and of a clergyman's daughter. My parents had only 2 children, both sons, and I was the younger by about 3 years. 2 very different strains had gone to our making. My father belonged to the first generation of his family that reached professional station. His grandfather had been a Welsh farmer, his father, a self-made man, had begun life as a workman, immigrated to Ireland, and ended as a partner in the firm of Musselwhite and Lewis, boilermakers, engineers, and iron shipbuilders. My mother was a Hamilton with many generations of clergymen, lawyers, sailors, and the like behind her. On her mother's side, through the Warrens, the blood went back to a Norman knight whose bones lie at Battle Abbey. The two families from which I spring were as different in temperament as in origin. My father's people were true Welshmen, sentimental, passionate, and rhetorical, easily moved both to anger and to tenderness. Men who laughed and cried a great deal and who had not much of the talent for happiness. The ironic, the Hamiltons were a cooler race. The Hamiltons were a cooler race. Their minds were critical and ironic, and they had the talent for happiness in a high degree. Went straight for it as experienced travelers go for the best seat in a train. From my earliest years, I was aware of the vivid contrast between my mother's cheerful and tranquil affection and the ups and downs of my father's emotional life, and this bred in me long before I was old enough to give it a name, a certain distrust or dislike of emotion as something uncomfortable and embarrassing and even dangerous. Both my parents, by the standards of the time and place, were bookish or clever people. My mother had been a promising mathematician in her youth and a BA of Queen's College, Belfast, and before her my mother had been a promising mathematician in her youth and a BA of Queen's College, Belfast, and before her death was able to start me both in French and Latin. And before her death was able to start me both in French and Latin. She was a voracious reader of good novels, and I think the Merediths and Tolstoys, which I have inherited, were bought for her. My father's tastes were quite different. He was fond of oratory and had himself spoken on political platforms in England as a young man. If he had had independent means, he could certainly have aimed at a political career. In this, unless his sense of honor, which was fine to the point of being quixotic, had made him unmanageable, he might well have succeeded, for he had many of the gifts once needed by a parliamentarian: a fine presence, a resonant voice, great quickness of mind, eloquence, and memory. Trollope's political novels were very dear to him in following the career of Phineas Finn-Hivers, as I now suppose, vicariously gratifying his own desires. He was fond of poetry, provided it had elements of rhetoric or pathos, or both. I think Othello was his favorite Shakespearean play. I think Othello was his favorite Shakespearean play. He greatly enjoyed nearly all humorous authors from Dickens to W. Jacobs, and was himself almost without rival the best raconteur I had ever heard. The best, that is, of his own type, the type that acts all the characters in the turn with a free use of grimace, gesture, and pantomime. He was never happier than when closeted for an hour or so with one or two of my uncles, exchanging wages, as anecdotes were oddly called in our family. What neither he nor my mother had the least taste for was that kind of literature to which my allegiance was given the moment I could choose books for myself. Neither had ever listed for the haunts of Elfland. There was no copy either of Keats or Shelley in the house, and the copy of Coleridge was never, to my knowledge, opened. If I am a romantic, my parents bear no responsibility for it. Tennyson, indeed, my father liked, but it was the Tennyson of In Memoriam and Locksley Hall. I never heard from him of the Lotus Eaters or the Morte d'Arthur. My mother, I have been told, cared for no poetry at all. In addition to good parents, good food, and a garden, which then seemed large to play in, I began life with two other blessings. One was our nurse, Lizzie Endicott, in whom even the exacting memory of childhood can discover no flaw, nothing but kindness, gaiety, and good sense. There was no nonsense about lady nurses in those days. Through Lizzie, we struck our roots into the peasantry of County Down. We were thus free of two very important social worlds. To this I owe my lifelong immunity from the false identification which some people make of refinement with virtue. From before I can remember, I had understood that certain jokes could be shared with Lizzie which were impossible in the drawing room, and also that Lizzie was, as nearly as a human can be, simply good. The other blessing was my brother. Though 3 years my senior, he never seemed to be an elder brother. We were, at least not to say, confederates from the first. Yet we were very different. Our earliest pictures, and I can remember no time when we were not incessantly drawing, reveal it. Our earliest pictures within brackets, and I can remember no time when we were not incessantly drawing, bracket close, reveal it. His were of ships and trains and battles. Mine were not imitated from his, were of what we both called dressed animals. The anthropomorphized the anthropomorphized the anthropomorphized the anthropomorphized beasts of nursery literature. The anthropomorphized the anthropomorphized beasts of nursery literature. His earlier story as my elder, he preceded me in the transition from drawing to writing, was called The Young Raja. He had already made India his country. Animal Land was mine. I do not think any of the surviving drawings date from the first 6 years of my life which I am now describing, but I have plenty of them that cannot be much later. From them it appears to me that I had the better talent. From a very early age I could draw movement, figures that looked as if they were really running or fighting, and the perspective is good, but nowhere either in my brother's work or my own is there a single line drawn in obedience to an idea, however crude, of beauty. There is action, comedy, invention, but there is not even the germ of a feeling for design, and there is a shocking ignorance of natural form. Trees appear as balls of cotton wool stuck on posts, and there is nothing to show that either of us knew the shape of any leaf in the garden where we played almost daily. This absence of beauty, now that I come to think of it, is characteristic of our childhood. No picture on the walls of my father's house ever attracted, and indeed none deserved our attention. We never saw a beautiful building nor imagined that a building could be beautiful. My earliest aesthetic experiences, if indeed they were aesthetic, were not of that kind. They were already incurably romantic, not formal. Once in those very early days, my brother brought into the nursery the lid of a biscuit tin which he had covered with moss and garnished with twigs and flowers so as to make it a toy garden or a toy forest. That was the first beauty I ever knew. What the real garden had failed to do, the toy garden did. It made me aware of nature, not indeed as a storehouse of forms and colors, but as something cool, dewy, fresh, exuberant. I do not think the impression was very important at the moment, but it soon became important in memory. As long as I live, my imagination of paradise will retain something of my brother's toy garden. And every day there were what we call the green hills, that is, the low line of the Castlereagh Hills, which we saw from the nursery windows. They were not very far off, but they were to children quite unattainable. They taught me longing. Shen Suchit. Shen Suchit. Shen Such. Shen Suchit. They taught me longing. Shen Suchit. Made me for good or ill. And before I was 6 years old, a watery of the blue flower. If aesthetic experiences were rare, religious experiences did not occur at all. Some people have got the impression from my books that I was brought up in strict and vivid Puritanism, but this is quite untrue. I was taught the usual things and made to say my prayers and in due time taken to church. I naturally accepted what I was told, but cannot remember feeling much interest in it. My father, far from being specially puritanical, was by 19th century and Church of Ireland standards rather high, and his approach to religion as to literature was at the opposite pole from what later became my own. The charm of tradition and the verbal beauty of a Bible and prayer book, all of them for me late and acquired tastes, were his natural delight, and it would have been hard to find an equally intelligent man who cared so little for metaphysics. Of my mother's religion, I can say almost nothing from my own memory. My childhood, at all events, was not in the least otherworldly. Except for the toy garden and the green hills, it was not even imaginative. It lives in my memory mainly as a period of humdrum, prosaic happiness, and awakes none of the poignant nostalgia with which I look back on my much less happy boyhood. It is not settled happiness but momentary joy that glorifies the past. To this general happiness there was one exception. I remember nothing earlier than the terror of certain dreams. It is a very common trouble at that age, yet it still seems to me odd that petted and guarded childhood should so often have in it a window opening on what is hardly less than hell. My bad dreams were of two kinds, those about spectres and those about insects. My bad dreams were of two kinds, those about spectres and those about insects. The second were beyond comparison the worst. To this day, I would rather meet a ghost than a tarantula, and to this day I could almost find it in my heart to rationalize and justify my phobia. As Owen Barfield once said to me, the trouble about insects is that they are like French locomotives. They have all the works on the outside, the works that is, the trouble. Their angular limbs, their jerky movements, their dry metallic noises all suggest either machines that have come to life or life degenerating into mechanism. You may add that in the hive and the ant hill we see fully realized the two things that some of us most dread for our own species, the dominance of the female and the dominance of the collective. One fact about the history of this phobia is perhaps worth recording. Much later in my teens, from reading Lubbock's Ants, Bees, and Wasps, I developed for the first time a genuinely scientific interest in insects. Other studies soon crowded it out, but while my entomological period lasted, my fear almost vanished. And I am inclined to think a real objective curiosity will usually have this cleansing effect. I am afraid the psychologists will not be content to explain my insect fears by what a simpler generation would diagnose as their cause, a certain detestable picture in one of my nursery books. In it, a midget child, Tom Thumb, a sort of Tom Thumb, stood on a toadstool and was threatened from below by a stag beetle very much larger than himself. This was bad enough, but there is worse to come. The horns of the beetle were strips of cardboard separate from the plate and working on a pivot. By moving a devilish contraption on the verso, you could make them open and shut like pincers. Snip, snap, snip, snap. I can see it while I write. How a woman ordinarily so wise as my mother could have allowed this abomination into the nursery is difficult to understand, unless, indeed, within brackets, for now a doubt assails me, bracket close, unless that picture itself is a product of nightmare, but I think not. In 1905, my 7th year, the first great change in my life took place. We moved house. My father, growing, I suppose, in prosperity, decided to leave the semi-detached villa in which I had been born and build himself a much larger house further out into what was then the country. The new house, as we continued for years to call it, was a large one even by my present standards. To a child, it seemed less like a house than a city. My father, who had more capacity for being cheated than any man I have ever known, was badly cheated by his builders. The drains were wrong, the chimneys were wrong, and there was a draft in every room. None of this, however, mattered to a child. To me, the important thing about the move was that the background of my life became larger. The new house is almost a major character in my story. I am a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in solitude, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tiles. Also of endless books. My father bought all the books he read and never got rid of any of them. There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books in the clock room, books within brackets, too deep, bracket close, in the great bookcase on the landing, books in a bedroom, books piled as high as my shoulder in the cistern attic, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my parents' interests, books of all kinds reflecting every transient stage of my father's interests, books readable and unreadable, books suitable for a child and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me, as a man who walks into a field has of finding a new blade of grass. Where all these books had been before we came to the new house is a problem that never occurred to me until I began writing this paragraph. I have no idea of the answer. Out of doors was the view for which, no doubt, the site had principally been chosen. From our front door, we looked down over wide fields to Belfast Lough, Belfast Lough, and across it to the long mountain line of the Antrim shore, Divis Colin Cave Hill. This was in the far off days when Britain was the world's carrier and the Lough was full of shipping, a delight to both us boys, but most to my brother. The sound of a steamer's horn at night still conjures up my whole boyhood. Behind the house, greener, lower, and nearer than the Antrim mountains, were the Hollywood Hills, but it was not till much later that they won my attention. The northwestern prospect was what mattered at first. The interminable summer sunsets behind the blue ridges and the rooks flying home. In these surroundings, the blows of change began to fall. First of all, my brother was packed off to an English boarding school and thus removed from my life for the greater part of every year. I remember well the rapture of his homecomings for the holidays, but have no recollection of any corresponding anguish at his departures. His new life made no difference to the relations between us. I, meanwhile, was going on with my education at home, French and Latin from my mother, and everything else from an excellent governess, Annie Harper. I made rather a bugbear of this mild and modest little lady at the time, but all that I can remember assures me that I was unjust. She was a Presbyterian, and a longish lecture which she once interpolated between sums and copies is the first thing I can remember that brought the other world to my mind with any sense of reality, but there were many things that I thought about more. My real life, or what memory reports as my real life, was increasingly one of solitude. I had indeed plenty of people to talk to. My parents, my grandfather Louis, prematurely old and deaf, who lived with us, the maids, and a somewhat bibulous old gardener. I was, I believe, an intolerable chatterbox, but solitude was nearly always at my command, somewhere in the garden or somewhere in the house. I had now learned both to read and to write. I had a dozen things to do. What drove me to write was the extreme manual clumsiness from which I have always suffered. I attributed it to a physical defect which my brother and I both inherit from our father. We have only one joint in the thumb, the upper joint within brackets that farthest from the nail. That farthest from the nail is visible, but it is a mere sham. We cannot bend it. But whatever the cause, Nature laid on me from birth an utter incapacity to make anything. With pencil and pen, I was handy enough, and I can still tie as good a bow as ever lay on a man's collar. But with a tool or a bat or a gun, a sleeve link or a corkscrew, I have always been unteachable. It was this that forced me to write. I longed to make things, ships, houses, engines. Many sheets of cardboard and pairs of scissors I spoiled, only to turn from my hopeless failures in tears. As a last resource, as a pis aller, I was driven to write stories instead. I was driven to write stories instead, little dreaming to what a world of happiness I was being admitted. You can do more with a castle in a story than with the best cardboard castle that ever stood on a nursery table. I soon staked out a claim to one of the attics and made it my study. Pictures of my own making or cut from the brightly colored Christmas numbers of magazines were nailed on the walls. There I kept my pen and ink pot and writing books and paint box, and there. What more felicity can fall to creature? What more felicity can fall to creature than to enjoy delight with liberty? Here my first stories were written and illustrated with enormous satisfaction. They were an attempt to combine my two chief literary pleasures, dressed animals and knights in armor. As a result, I wrote about chivalrous mice and rabbits who rode out in complete mile to kill not giants but cats. But already the mood of the systematizer was strong in me. The mood which led Trollope so endlessly to elaborate his Barsetshire. The animal land which came into action in the holidays when my brother was at home was a modern animal land. It had to have trains and steamships if it was to be a country shared with him. It followed, of course, that the medieval animal land about which I wrote my stories must be the same country at an earlier period, and of course, the two periods must be properly connected. This led me from romancing to historiography. I set about writing a full history of animal land. Though more than one version of this instructive work is extant, I never succeeded in bringing it down to modern times. Centuries take a deal of filling when all the events have to come out of the historian's head. But there is one touch in the history that I still recall with some pride. The chivalric adventures which filled my stories were in it alluded to very lightly, and the reader was warned that they might be only legends. Somehow, but heaven knows how, I realized even then that a historian should adopt a critical attitude towards epic material. From history, it was only a step to geography. There was soon a map of animal land, several maps, all tolerably consistent. Then, animal land had to be geographically related to my brother's India, and India consequently lifted out of its place in the real world. We made it an island and its north coast running along the back of the Himalayas. Between it and animal land, my brother rapidly invented the principal steamship routes. Soon there was a whole world and a map of that world which used every color in my paint box, and those parts of the world which we regarded as our own animal land and India were increasingly peopled with consistent characters. Of the books that I read at this time, very few have quite faded from memory, but not all have retained my love. Conan Doyle's Sir Nigel, which first set my mind upon knights in armor. I have never felt inclined to reread. Still less would I now read Mark Twain's Yankee at the Court of King Arthur, which was then my only source for the Arthurian story, blissfully read for the sake of the romantic elements that came through and with total disregard of the vulgar ridicule directed against them. Much better than either of these was E. Nesbit's trilogy, Five Children and It, The Phoenix and the Wishing Carpet and the Amulet. The last did most for me. It first opened my eyes to antiquity, the dark background and the abysm of time. I can still reread it with delight. Gulliver is an unexpurgated and lavishly illustrated edition was one of my favorites, and I pored endlessly over an almost complete set of old punches which stood in my father's study. Tenniel gratified my passion for dressed animals with his Russian bear, British lion, Egyptian crocodile, and the rest, while his slovenly and perfunctory treatment of vegetation confounded my own deficiencies. Then came the Beatrix Potter books, and here at last beauty. It will be clear that at this time, at the age of 6, 7, and 8, I was living almost entirely in my imagination, or at least that the imaginative experience of those years now seems to me more important than anything else. Thus, I pass over a holiday in Normandy, of which, nevertheless, I retain very clear memories, as a thing of no account. If it could be cut out of my past, I should still be almost exactly the man I am. But imagination is a vague word, and I must make some distinctions. It may mean the world of reverie, daydream, wish fulfilling fantasy. Of that, I knew more than enough. I often pictured myself cutting a fine finger, but I must insist that this was a totally different activity from the invention of Animal Land. Animal Land was not, in that sense, a fantasy at all. I was not one of the characters it contained. I was its creator, not a candidate for admission to it. Invention is essentially different from reverie. If some fail to recognize the difference, that is because they have not themselves experienced both. Anyone who has will understand me. Anyone who has will understand me. In my daydreams, I was training myself to be a fool. In mapping and chronicling Animal Land, I was training myself to be a novelist. Note well, a novelist, not a poet. My invented world was full for me of interest, puzzle, humor, and character, but there was no poetry, even no romance in it. It was almost astonishingly prosaic. Thus, if we use the word imagination in a third sense and the highest sense of all, this invented world was not imaginative, but certain other experiences were, and I will now try to record them. The thing has been much better done by Traherne and Wordsworth, but every man must tell his own tale. The first is itself the memory of a memory. As I stood beside a flowering currant bush on a summer day, there suddenly arose in me, without warning, and as if from a depth not of years but of centuries, the memory of that earlier morning of the old house when my brother had brought his toy garden into the nursery. It is difficult to find words strong enough for the sensation which came over me. Milton's enormous bliss of Eden, giving the full ancient meaning to enormous, comes somewhere near it. It was a sensation, of course, of desire, but desire for what? Not certainly for a biscuit tin filled with moss, nor even within brackets, though that came into it, bracket close, for my own past. Some strange Greek word is appearing which the reader could not pronounce. And before I knew what I desired, the desire itself was gone. The whole glimpse withdrawn, the world turned commonplace again, or only stirred by a longing for the longing that had just ceased. It had taken only a moment of time, and in a certain sense, everything else that had ever happened to me was insignificant in comparison. The second glimpse came through Squirrel Nutkin, through it only, though I loved all the Beatrix Potter books. But the rest of them were merely entertaining. It administered the shock. It was a trouble. It troubled me with what I can only describe as the idea of autumn. It sounds fantastic to say that one can be enamored of a season, but there is something like what happened. And as before, the experience was one of intense desire, and one went back to the book, not to gratify the desire that was impossible. How can one possess autumn bracket close, but to reawake it? And in this experience also there was the same surprise and the same sense of incalculable importance. It was something quite different from ordinary life and even from ordinary pleasure, something, as they would now say, in another dimension. The third glimpse came through poetry. I had become fond of Longfellow's saga of King Olaf, fond of it in a casual, shallow way for its story and its vigorous rhythms. But then, and quite different from such pleasures, and like a voice from far more distant regions, there came a moment when I turned the pages of the book and found the unrhymed translation of Tegner's Drapa and read. I heard a voice that cried, "Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead." I knew nothing about Balder, but instantly I was uplifted into huge regions of northern sky. I desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described, except that it is cold, spacious, severe, pale, and remote. And then, as in the other examples, found myself at the very same moment already falling out of that desire and wishing I were back in it. The reader who finds these 3 episodes of no interest need read this book no further, for in a sense the central story of my life is about nothing else. For those who are still disposed to proceed, I will only underline the quality common to the 3 experiences. It is that of an unsatisfied desire, which is itself more desirable than any other satisfaction. I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and from pleasure. Joy, in my sense, has indeed one characteristic and one only in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it will want it again. Apart from that, and considered only in its quality, it might almost equally well be called a particular kind of unhappiness or grief, but then it is the kind we want. I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if possible were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. But then joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is. I cannot be absolutely sure whether the things I have just been speaking of happened before. I cannot be absolutely sure whether the things I have just been speaking of happened before or after the great loss which befell our family and to which I must now turn. I cannot be absolutely sure whether the things I have just been speaking of happened before or after the great loss which befell our family and to which I must now turn. There came a night when I was ill and crying both with headache and toothache and distressed because my mother did not come to me. That was because she was ill too, and what was odd was that there were several doctors in her room, and voices and comings and goings all over the house, and doors shutting and opening. It seemed to last for hours. And then my father, in tears, came into my room and began to try to convey to my terrified mind things it had never conceived before. It was, in fact, cancer and followed the usual course. An operation they operated in the patient's house in those days. An apparent convalescence, a return of the disease, increasing pain and death. My father never fully recovered from this loss. Children suffer not, within brackets, I think, less than their elders, but differently. Children suffer not, within brackets, I think, less than their elders, but differently. For us boys, the real bereavement had happened before our mother died. We lost her gradually as she was gradually withdrawn from our life into the hands of nurses and delirium and morphia, and as our whole existence changed into something alien and menacing, as the house became full of strange smells and midnight noises and sinister whispered conversations. This had two further results, one very evil and one very good. It divided us from our father as well as our mother. They say that a shared sorrow draws people closer together. I can hardly believe that it often has that effect when those who share it are of widely different ages. If I may turn my own experience, the sight of adult misery and adult terror has an effect on children which is merely paralyzing and alienating. Perhaps it was our fault. Perhaps if we had been better children, we might have lightened our father's sufferings at this time. We certainly did not. His nerves had never been of the steadiest, and his emotions had always been uncontrolled. Under the pressure of anxiety, his temper became incalculable. He spoke wildly and acted unjustly. Thus, by a peculiar cruelty of fate, during these months, the unfortunate man, had he but known it, was really losing his sons as well as his wife. We were coming, my brother and I, to rely more and more exclusively on each other for all that made life bearable, to have confidence only in each other. I expect that we, within brackets, or at any rate I, bracket close, were already learning to lie to him. Everything that had made the house a home had failed us, everything except one another. We drew daily closer together. That was the good result. Two frightened urchins huddled for warmth in a bleak world. Grief in childhood is complicated with many other miseries. I was taken into the bedroom where my mother lay dead, as they said, to see her. In reality, as I at once knew to see it, there was nothing that a grown-up would call disfigurement, except for the total disfigurement which is death itself. Grief was overwhelmed in terror. To this day, I do not know what they mean when they call dead bodies beautiful. The ugliest man alive is an angel of beauty compared with the loveliest of the dead. Against all the subsequent paraphernalia of coffin, flowers, hearsay, and funeral, I reacted with horror. I even lectured one of my aunts on the absurdity of mourning clothes in a style which would have seemed to most adults both heartless and precocious, but this was our dear Aunt Annie, my maternal uncle's Canadian wife, a woman almost as sensible and sunny as my mother herself. To my hatred for what I already felt to be all the fuss and flummery of the funeral, I may perhaps trace something in me which I now recognize as a defect, but which I have never fully overcome: a distaste for all that is public, all that belongs to the collective, a boorish inaptitude for formality. My mother's death was the occasion of what some, but not I, might regard as my first religious experience. When her case was pronounced hopeless, I remembered what I had been taught, that prayers offered in faith would be granted. I accordingly set myself to produce by willpower a firm belief that my prayers for her recovery would be successful, and as I thought, I achieved it. When nevertheless she died, I shifted my ground and worked myself into a belief that there was to be a miracle. The interesting thing is that my disappointment produced no results beyond itself. The thing hadn't worked, but I was used to things not working and I thought no more about it. I think the truth is that the belief into which I had hypnotized myself was itself too irreligious for its failure to cause any religious revolution. I had approached God or my idea of God without love, without awe, even without fear. He was in my mental picture of this miracle to appear neither as savior nor as judge, but merely as a magician. And when he had done what was required of him, I supposed he would simply, well, go away. It never crossed my mind that the tremendous contact which I solicited should have any consequences beyond restoring the status quo. I imagine that a faith of this kind is often generated in children and that its disappointment is of no religious importance, just as the things believed in, if they could happen and be only as the child pictures them, would be of no religious importance either. With my mother's death all settled, happiness with my mother's death all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. With my mother's death all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable, disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun, many pleasures, many stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis.